which is not ours. So we'll quickly move into introducing our next formidable speaker, Laurie Laufer. I'm sorry. So it's again quite an honor to be introducing Dr. Laufer, whom I had the pleasure of meeting just a couple of days ago for the first time in quite a different context at a Georgia O'Keeffe themed gala for a dance company. So I'm excited to hear your scholarly work in this context. She will be bringing her expertise as a psychoanalyst to her study of Foucault. And in addition to being a psychoanalyst, Dr. Laufer is director of the Institut Humanité, Sciences et Société, Institute for Humanities, Science and Society, and professeur in the Psychoanalytic Studies Department at Université Paris-Cité. She is the author of numerous articles on questions of norms, psychoanalysis and gender, and psychoanalysis in literature. And she has co-edited many works, including Foucault et la psychanalyse with Amos Scavere, Qu'est-ce que le genre, which has been translated into Spanish and Italian, with Florence Rochefort, Lettres à Lacan, which has been translated into Spanish, and Après les aveux de la chair, Genealogies du sujet chez Michel Foucault, with Sandra Boranger. Most recently, Dr. Laufer is the author of Murmures de l'art à la psychanalyse in 2021, Vers une psychanalyse émancipée, renouée avec la subversion in 2022, which has been translated into Spanish as well as Turkish, and Question de genre also in 2022 with Serge Efez. And currently with Sandra Boranger, she is co-directing the translation of Gay Shame, which will be published in 2024 soon. So I expect that this impressive array of publications and translations makes our audience as keen as I am to hear Dr. Laufer's talk today on the question, why should we still read Michel Foucault when practicing psychoanalysis? So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa. Well. First, I would like to thank very warmly Professor Nikki Clements for inviting me to share with you some thoughts based on my reading of Michel Foucault, the genealogist of psychoanalysis. Why should a psychoanalyst read Foucault? Is Michel Foucault still relevant for psychoanalysts in 2024? In 1998, Jean Alouche warned that psychoanalysis will need to be Foucauldian or will perish, unquote. And a warning which be repeated about 20 years later in 2014, showing that it had not produced all the intended and necessary effects. If psychoanalysis is to remain open to revision, as Freud wrote in The Question of Lay Analysis, then psychoanalysts undoubtedly need to keep reading and rereading Michel Foucault. This also calls on psychoanalysts to take an interest in the field of research for which Michel Foucault provided a crucial inspiration across the Atlantic, including queer studies, gay and lesbian studies, and gender studies, and in which the most important scholars like Leo Bersani, Judith Butler, Tim Dean, Lee Edelman, David Halperin, Eve Kosowski Sedgwick, Gail Rubin, John Scott, or Teresa de Lauretis, among others, have all been keen and dedicated readers of Foucault. The question Foucault raises has to do with the condition of possibility for thinking the sexuality, and sexual identity outside of a universalizing and heteronormative binary gender structure. Quote, is it possible to construct another way of thinking the sexual? Teresa de Lauretis wondered. In France, in 70s also saw a flurry of publication for scholars seeking to criticize and challenge the invariant categories, universalist and ahistorical principle underpinning psychology. Some milestone in this intellectual movement that combined interest in psychoanalysis, the politics of the subject and sexuality include, for example, L'anti-Oedipe, schizophrénie et capitalisme by Deleuze and Guattari, Le désir homosexuel by Guy Hockenheim, both published in 1972, Le psychanalysme by Robert Castel, Le corps lesbien by Monique Wittig, published in 1933. In 1974 saw the publication of Lacan's seminar book 20 Encore on feminine jouissance. I like this, jouissance in French, it's the same in English, okay. And of Speculum of l'autre femme by Luce Irigaray. Foucault's Will to Knowledge was published in 1976. In 1976, in The Will of Knowledge, Michel Foucault analyzed how, quote, the history of the deployment of sexuality as it had evolved since the classical age can serve as an archaeology of psychoanalysis. In the section entitled The Repressive Hypothesis, he showed the process by which sex was turned into discourse, in particular through the imperative of confession, and the way psychoanalysis, with promise a liberation, was born out of this repressive process itself. Repression and liberation are the two sides of the same discourse, sustaining an austere monarchy of sex, and should be recognized as ruses of sexuality. The book ends on the following words, quote, the irony of this deployment is in having us believe that our liberation is in the balance, unquote. Foucault says it's now time to overthrow the monarchy of sex and create new ways of thinking pleasure and love relationships. How can psychoanalysis, following Foucault, the genealogist of Freudian psychoanalysis, still proceed while divesting itself all of discourse on the heterosexual family, the Oedipus complex or its beyond, sexuality theology, or infantile sexuality? That is a question. Is it possible to develop a theory and practice of psychoanalysis based on the radical rethinking of the discourse of sexuality, the very site of its emergence? Jean Alouche, Jean Alouche summed up the problem in his presentation of the collection Les Grands Classiques de l'Érotologie Moderne, quote, but you can read also. It's probably better for you. In English language bookshops, gay and lesbian studies and queer studies have been old shelves, journal and collection. They have now reached the stage of compilation. Yet, France remains stubbornly ignorant of a debate that has been going on for over 20 years. One unexpected consequence of this is that in hindsight, it's now possible to distinguish the publications and authors who, over time, have become classics. Is it mere chance of this emergence, this renewed questions of eros, this new relation to eroticism first occurred precisely where psychoanalysis had ceased to be questioning and inventive? Neglected by psychoanalysis, the problematization of contemporary eroticism are developed outside the Freudian field. They are not merely academic debates. Individuals' relations to sex have also been transformed, as have the place and function of sex in the community or communities. The ambition would be to understand a little better what the works of Aphrodite consisted. Unquote. As can be seen, In this presentation, no mention is made of sexuality, but of eros. In 1973, Lacan was already determined to bring about, quote, revamping in the realm of eros, quote. In a 1975 interview, Foucault asked, quote, why this sacralizing modesty, pudeur in French, that insists on denying that psychoanalysis has anything to do with normalization, unquote. While Foucault did give Freud credit for being the first to undertake the radical erasure of the division between positive and negative, between the normal and the pathological, the comprehensible and the incommunicable, the significant and the non-significant, in particular in this examination of madness, from 1970s onward, he developed a strong critique of psychoanalysis. According to him, psychoanalysis had followed in the wake of the emergence of discourses on sexuality and become part of system of power and knowledge organized around sexuality. Quote, an imperative was established, he wrote in the Will of Knowledge, quote, not only will you confess to acts contravening the law, but you will seek to transform your desire, your every desire, into discourse, unquote. Psychoanalysis shared a part in the discursive power at the root of the emergence of scientia sexualis, and was instrumental in the process of normalizing sexual practices. Michel Foucault credited Freud with two major epistemological breakthroughs concerning madness and degeneration theories. In both cases, Freud's contribution lay in the blurring of the line between the normal and the pathological. Right, Frédéric, go. This is the fault of Foucault. This is where we must do justice to France, said Foucault. In Madness and Civilization, Pierre Janet enumerated the element of the division, drew up his inventory, annexed here and there, perhaps concreted. Freud went back to madness at the level of its language, reconstituted one of the essential elements of an experience reduced to silence by positivism. He did not make a major addition to the list of psychological treatments for madness. He restored in medical thought the possibility of a dialogue with unreason. It is not psychology that is involved in psychoanalysis, but precisely an experience of inner reason that it has been psychology's meaning in the modern world to mask. This was the first major step to take, according to Foucault. The invention of psychoanalysis made a critique of the psychological and psychiatric sciences possible. Freud recognized that there was a language in madness, a subjective construction in delirium, thus distancing himself from the psychiatric categories used in his time. What Freud managed to do was precisely to free psychoanalysis from the empire of medicine and psychiatry. Foucault pays tribute to Freud for inventing a radically new way of approaching the pathological madness and its language. Freud's other decisive contribution, according to Foucault, was his dismissal of degeneration theories. The ideology of degeneration that presided over the way pathology were defined and addressed, especially hysteria and homosexuality, and Freud broke with the notion that they were hereditary disease that could be passed down from one generation to the next. The term sexuality or homosexuality, perversion, and so on no longer hold the same meaning today as they did in Freud's time, because all notions should be considered in relation to the contemporary context. As Arnaud Davidson explained, the concept of perversion of sexuality must not be identified with some self-subsistent object whose content can be discovered by some kind of intellectual intuition. This concept had to be identified by the uses that are made of them, by the connection that govern their employment and that allow them to enter into what Foucault thought of a specific games of truth, jeux de vérité. Since these uses, connection, and games of truth are not be analyzed in metaphysical and transcendental terms as if they were fixed and unrevisable, one should not be surprised to find those of us influenced by Foucault insisting that we must attend to the history of the emergence of this game of truth. Concepts should then never be divorced from the practice of their use. The sentence, dreams fulfill desires, may have been repeated through the centuries. It is not the same statement in Plato and in Freud, Foucault writes in the Archaeology of Knowledge. The conditions for using concepts and the fields of experience are affected by events and their reverberation. When the modalities of this transformation are not taken into account, this widens the gap between Freudian theory and the practice from which it springs. An epistemology of the movements of psychoanalysis remains to be written. Psychoanalysis has an history and has produced a history. But as Michel de Certeau suggests, when psychoanalysis forgets its own history, that is, in its internal relation to conflicts of power and position, it becomes either a mechanism of drives, a dogmatism of discourse, a gnosis of symbols. De Certeau called for a repoliticization of established practice and discourses, that is both a repoliticization within psychoanalysis and a repoliticization of psychoanalysis in relation to the history within which it has evolved and by which it has been transformed. Psychoanalytic practice, which remains based on transference, necessarily needs to consider its own political position. If the discourse of sexuality remains geared to the constriction of sentia sexualis, then psychoanalytic practice can only fail to accomplish what its objective should have been, inventing an erotology. Lacan claimed, I am not developing for you a direct logical psychosis, a discourse about this in reality which is called the psyche, but a praxis which merits a name, erotology. Jean Alouche pursued, psychoanalysis will set itself an erotology only when it dismisses the binary divide between men and women. This erotological relationality dispenses with the binary gender structure and develops apart from constructed identities. When one loves, it has nothing to do with sex, said Lacan. The creation of new relation mode of lives, the promotion of friendships as a way of life would make it possible to reconsider the moral hierarchy found under discourse of sexuality. Jean Alouche. We are fully in line with Foucault's ultimate act, which consists in launching a new erotology. Admittedly, psychoanalysis lapsed back into the kind of degeneration which had provided 19th century societies with a fine erotic argument in favor of racism and nationalism. For instance, when it starts defining a sexual norm, saying that psychoanalysis is an erotology, to what extent it is so, and why this erotology is not the right one for everyone, precisely means resisting the kind of normalization with Foucault detailed in Freud. Therefore, as Gail Rubin suggests, it is necessary to examine and critique the notion of a sexual hierarchy, in particular through what she calls, quote, a concept of benign sexual variation. She explains that sexual diversity exists. Not everyone likes to do the same thing. And people who have different sexual preferences are not sick, stupid, warped, brainwashed under the duress, dupes of the patriarchy, products of bourgeois decadence, or refugees from the bad child rearing practices. The habit of explaining away sexual variation by putting it down needs to be broken. The classification of sexual practices and therefore of pleasure creates moral and normalizing dividing lines. According to Rubin, quote, the most despised sexual castes currently include transsexual, transvestite, fetishist, sadomasochist, sex workers such as prostitutes and porn model, and the lowliest of all, those whose eroticism transgresses generational boundaries. Rubin criticized the etiological obsession with which the diversity of sexual practices is faced. According to her, sexual acts are burned with an excess of significance, which laid the ground for the sexia sexualis established with Krafft-Ebing and for his psychopathological categorization. In this perspective, a radical theory of sex must identify, describe, explain, and denounce erotic injustice and sexual oppression. Account her. Rubin follows in Foucault's footsteps when he brings up the question of experience, of the experimentation of pleasure considered as practice. According to Foucault, quote, in the erotic art, truth is drawn from pleasure itself, understood as a practice and accumulated as experience. On the face of it, at least, our civilization possesses no ars erotica. In return, it's undoubtedly the only civilization to practice scientia sexualis. The erotological experience, whether it be a sexual practice, the practice of friendship, or a way of life, is a form of knowledge of eros. And the analytic experience precisely lies in the intensification of the transference experience. If psychoanalysis is a middle, it holds itself at the place of love, according to Lacan. This aptitude for love belongs with what Foucault called new relation modes. Some of Lacan's disciples were probably unable or unwilling to theorize this love, leaving the field to scientia sexualis. They probably felt it was too risky to move away from a position with what was fraught with knowledge and granted certain power. Multiplicity, variation, variability, possibilities, experiences, events are thus the central notion of Foucauldian epistemology, calling into question the classical reliance of the concept of identity on fixed categories and on transcendence. Commenting on the archaeology of knowledge, Deleuze wrote that Foucault's book represents the most decisive step he had taken in the theory practice of multiplicities. There are many multiplicities he had. There is not only the great dualism of discursive and non-discursive multiplicities. Among the discursive elements, there are also all families of formation of statement whose catalogue is open and subject to constant change. This insistence on multiplicities, this desire to explore the field of possibilities, contradicts any attempt at categorizing identities or practices and at established disciplinary boundaries. Following Foucault, the major epistemological challenge now lie in finding ways of thinking fluctuation and multiplicities, thinking the genealogy, or even thinking displacement and series. Reading and working with Foucault convinces one of the heuristic value of challenging, subverting, overturning familiar categories, of the heuristic value of irony and laughter. No analytic experience, indeed, would be possible without irony, without an attitude of amusement about the world, protecting one from being deceived by the answer given by any type of established this system, any form of fixed knowledge. By way of illustration, and inspired by the Foucauldian method, I would now like to compare three lists that defy the very principle of fixed, rigid sexual categories, and that, through their multiplicities and variation, demonstrate the fluidity, playfulness, and irony of sexual invention. This series consists of lists drawn up by Freud, one, by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, and of a final one found on Facebook. I think Freud would have been amused to observe that his lecture of the sexual life of human beings should have inspired multiple variation. In this lecture delivered in 1916 to an audience of traditionally minded Viennese doctors, Freud drew up the list of all sorts of sexual practices without classification them into categories, and conclude that they were in all instances of normal sexuality. So, Freud, if you mind.
Okay. Then come others again who have abandoned the genital as an object altogether and have taken some other part of the body as the object they desire, a woman's breast, a foot, or a plate of hair. After them come others for whom parts of the body are of no importance, but whose every wish is satisfied by a piece of clothing, a shoe, a piece of underclothing, the fetishists. Later in the procession come people who require the whole object indeed, but make quite definite demands of it, strange or horrible, even that it must have become a defenseless corpse, and who, using criminal violence, make it into one so that they may enjoy it. The second group is led by perverts who have made what is normally only an introductory or preparatory act into the aim of their sexual wishes. They are people whose desire it is to look at the other person, or to feel him, or to watch him in the performance of his intimate actions, or who expose parts of their own bodies which should be covered in the obscure expectation that they may be rewarded by a corresponding action in return. Next come the sadists, puzzling people whose tender endeavors have no other aim than to cause pain and torment to their object, ranging from humiliation to severe physical injuries. And as though to counterbalance them, their counterparts, the masochists, whose only pleasure it is to suffer humiliations and torments of every kind from their loved object, either symbolically or in reality. There are still others in whom several of these abnormal preconditions are united and intertwined. And lastly, we must learn that each of these groups is to be found in two forms, alongside of those who seek their sexual satisfaction in reality are those who are content merely to imagine that satisfaction, who need no real object at all, but can replace it by their fantasies. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what attitude are we to adopt to these unusual kinds of sexual satisfaction? Indignation, an expression of our personal repugnance, and an assurance that we ourselves do not share these lusts will obviously be of no help. Indeed, that is not what we have been asked for. When all is said and done, what we have here is a field of phenomena like any other, a denial in the form of an evasive suggestion that after all these are only rarities and curiosities would be easy to refute. On the contrary, we are dealing with quite common and widespread phenomena. If, however, it is argued that we need not allow our views of sexual life to be misled by them because they are one and all aberrations and deviations of the sexual instinct, a serious answer is called for. Unless we can understand these pathological forms of sexuality and can coordinate them with normal sexual life, we cannot understand normal sexuality either.
80 years later, whoops, this is Freud. This is sexual. Mais c'est ça. C'est toujours comme ça avec Freud. Il y a un moment où on fait quelque chose. On tombe. The symptom. The symptom is a shit of the. Okay. Tout va bien?
Oui, ça va.
Okay. 80 years later, gender studies pursued their inventive exploration of gender and sexuality. And in 1978, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick defined the word queer as Eve.
The open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning, when the constituent elements of anyone's gender or anyone's sexuality aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. The experimental, linguistic, epistemological, representational, political adventures attaching to the very many of us who may at times be moved to describe ourselves as, among many other possibilities, pushy femmes, radical fairies, fantasists, fag hags or hag fags, drag queens or kings, clones, leather people, ladies in tuxedos, feminist women or feminist men, masturbators, bull dykes, divas, opera queens, butch bottoms, storytellers, transsexuals, aunties, wannabes, lesbian identified men or lesbians who sleep with men, or people able to relish, learn from, or identify with such folks.
No. The range of possibilities are still widened, and more than 20 years later, Facebook is offering more than 50 gender identifiers for its users. After clicking on the custom gender option, they can choose among the following list. Tu peux ne pas tout lire.
Tu veux ou pas?
Non, yeah.
D'accord. Oui, j'y vais. Okay. Agender, androgyne, androgynous, bigender, cisgender, cis female, cis male, cis man, cis woman, cisgender female, cisgender male, cisgender man, cisgender woman, female to male, F to M, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, gender questioning, gender variant, gender queer, intersex, male to female, M to F. Neither, neutroid, non-binary, other, pangender, trans asterisk, trans female, trans asterisk female, trans male, trans asterisk male, trans man, trans asterisk man, trans person, trans asterisk person, trans woman, trans asterisk woman, trans feminine, transgender, transgender female, transgender male, transgender man, transgender person, transgender woman, trans masculine, transsexual female, transsexual male, transsexual man, transsexual person, transsexual woman, two-spirit.
And so on. To conclude, in 1974, during the roundtable discussion that took place after his lecture on truth and juridical forms, Foucault was questioned by Henri Pellegrino about this position in relation to Oedipus. Michel Foucault, you found me hateful And you're right, I'm hateful. Oedipus, I don't know, who is it? When we say of Oedipus, that is desire, that is not desire, I reply, if you like. Who is Oedipus? What on earth is that? Pellegrino, a fundamental structure of human existence. Michel Foucault replied. Then I will reply in delusion terms, and here I'm entirely delusion. That is absolutely not a fundamental structure of human existence, but a certain kind of constraint, a certain relation of power and that society, that the family, political power, etc., establish over individuals. Pellegrino, the family is an incest factory. The family is an incest factory. Michel Foucault replied, take things in other way. The idea that was one desires first, fundamentally and essentially, what becomes the correlative of one's first object of desire is one's mother. This is where the discussion begins. Deleuze will tell you, and again, I side with them, with him. Why would anyone desire one's mother? It's not that amusing to have a mother in the first place. What does one desire? Well, one desires things, stories, fairy tales, Napoleon, Joan of Arc, everything. All of these things are object of desire. In inventing psychoanalysis, Freud and then Lacan had already at the same time outlined the conceptual and practical tools for transgressing its boundaries. Foucault's merit lies in having made a more effective and inventive use of them, in having made the move from categories to series, from perversity to diversity. Thank you for your attention. And thank you, special Freud, Eve Kosowski, Servet, and Facebook.